Hi, Vanessa.
Hi, Cara.
Today's conversation is about ACEs, which stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences, which is a term we use a lot. We use it on this podcast. We use it when we speak on the road. It's a term that you and I have gotten very comfortable with and used to, which is, once we get into this conversation, in and of itself disturbing. But it's a term that not everyone knows. And it's so critically important that we're going to spend an entire episode talking about it.
It's a hard topic because it really gets at the most difficult things a kid can encounter in their lives. And what's even more complicated about it is it's not like you have the experience and that experience equals this one particular outcome. These experiences, can happen once or can happen many times. These experiences happen in the context of a family and a community and a society. And they happen to human beings who are individual in their own ways. And so in this conversation, there's a lot of kind of tie-dye, for lack of a better description, of like the different ways you put the dye and you knot up the t-shirt and you put the t-shirt in the dye and you kind of don't know how the t-shirt's going to come out. Is it going to have lots of color and not a lot of white space, lots of white space and not a lot of color, and it falls in different ways? And so this is not a sort of blanket 1=1 situation. It's a much more complex tapestry that we're going to talk about.
I like that tie-dye analogy could be applied to almost everything we talk about. It's awesome. I can't believe we've never thought of that. So kudos to you, Vanessa,
Thank you
for that
very
one.
much.
Let me put like a little frame around this and say that we're going to explain what ACEs are and what they aren't. We're going to tell you where the term came from, and we're going to tell you how they impact puberty. And then we're going to tell you how to identify them and try to, I don't want to say treat them, because ACEs in and of themselves are social situations. So how to try to manage them or shift them. But we're also going to talk about what to do when you realize that you or someone in your life has experienced all of these ACEs. And I just want to start at the top by saying that there's a list of things that fall under the definition of ACEs they're really quite dramatic and they take your breath away. There's a list of things that don't fall under the list of ACEs that can have a lot of the same biological and physiological impacts that the ACEs do. So lest you think, oh, I'm going to stop listening to this episode now and go into one that might apply to my family a little bit more. I think this information is relevant to everyone because you or the kids in your life may have been exposed to ACEs that you didn't recognize. And also the way the body responds to stress is a lowest common denominator response. And at their core, the ACEs are stressors. And so understanding what is happening inside the body and what the risks are of having all these stressors come at you can inform the way that you help to raise kids, regardless of what their stressors are, whether they're on this extreme end of the spectrum or they're somewhere a little bit closer to what you would perceive as center. Does that make sense, Vanessa?
Yeah. I mean, to put a finer point on it, 2/3 of all people have experienced at least one ACE, and that will make sense in a second. Again, ACE stands for Adverse Childhood Experience, and we're going to go through the list. 3/4 of high schoolers report having experienced at least one ACE, and 1/8 of all people have experienced 4 or more. And interestingly, for high schoolers, 20%, 1/5 report 4 or more. So what that tells us is the rates amongst high schoolers are higher than the rates amongst the general public. And therefore, the rates amongst the general public, as these high schoolers age, one can infer that the rates are actually going to get higher than what is currently reported. And so when we think about who does this affect, this doesn't have to do with me, adverse childhood experience. When you hear the list, and there's one that you're going to be very interested by because it affects it's more than half our population, you're going to realize, oh, it basically affects almost all people at some, as we begin to unpack it.
That's right. So let's start with where the term even came from. And we're just going to take a trip back in time. We're going to go back to 1995. Between 1995 and 1996, Kaiser Permanente Health Plan in San Diego, the Kaiser system, which is actually a phenomenal research hub, the Kaiser system. And we've talked about a lot of the Kaiser research that's done on puberty on this podcast. Well, the Kaiser system was at the center of a study that was done in the mid-90s. They worked with almost 9,851 adults. And they asked them to complete questionnaires. And the questionnaires covered all sorts of childhood experiences. And in that data analysis, there was then sort of a new awareness of how common some of these childhood experiences were. And there was an ability to connect some of these childhood experiences with risks for other future outcomes. And now, 30 years later, we see a very large body of research around the ACEs. In fact, you cannot open a pediatric journal without seeing an article about one of the ACEs. You cannot go to a pediatric conference or meeting without having someone speak about the ACEs. Educators know about ACEs and they are trained to identify the ACEs. So this is not new information. This is fairly old by our standards, in the sense that 30 years of really good data is 30 years of really good data. If you want a couple of resources to check out, the resources that we're going to rely on most heavily for this episode come from the CDC and from the Cleveland Clinic. The Cleveland Clinic does a really good job in general of summarizing and distilling medical and scientific information. So we rely upon that source. Often you will find that a lot of the academic medical centers have very similar type content. Some of it is actually sourced from the same place. So Cleveland Clinic, Mayo Clinic, Penn Medicine, Harvard Health, these are large academic centers. And often if you go across their different pages, you'll see a lot of the same stuff. So for this episode, if you're looking to dig deeper, we're going to recommend Cleveland Clinic for this one.
So I think we want to talk about what ACEs are. I felt like we've built up the excitement here. There's kind of different lists. So if you look at different sources, the lists are not sort of uniform. They're kind of by category, which can include different kinds of experiences. So one big category, which could include a lot of different stuff, is experiencing violence, abuse, or neglect during childhood. And that's a very expansive, sadly, a very expansive, wide-ranging category. Witnessing violence in a home or a community, anything from bullying to shootings, that, can be an expansive category.
So just to be super clear, so if you experience it, if it happens to you, or if you see it.
Right. And so bullying, right? That's a really complex category. I mean, we could do 8 episodes on bullying.
We probably should.
And there's probably, as many definitions of bullying as there are episodes we could do. So it's not, again, this is not a kind of solitary defined unit of information. They're nuanced and complex. And I want to remind people, these are things that can happen once. You can witness a shooting once, or you can live in a neighborhood where violence, shootings are a regular part of life in your community, right? So sometimes, and 2 kids who live in the same neighborhood could be affected differently by those 2 things. And we'll get to that.
So, but along those lines, so there's experiencing the violence or abuse or neglect. There's witnessing all of it. And then there's having a family member experience it, but it didn't happen to you and you actually didn't see it, but it impacts your family. That's another kind of ACE.
Right. Because we know if it impacts one person, it can impact the family constellation. It can impact the mental health, well-being, the substance use choices of that family member, right? This is all like many, many different kinds of sort of potential domino effects or not, which is part of what makes it complicated. A really, really difficult one is children who either have a family member die by suicide or attempt suicide. And some lists include if a child loses a family member by any means, right? So, I mean, God forbid losing a family member to cancer or heart attack or, other ways that adults can die. And family member, right? Not parent, because we know that families are made in really different ways. And so it may be a grandparent or an aunt or uncle or an older sibling who's raising a kid. It may not be their biological parent.
If those categories aren't big enough and overwhelming enough, then there are all of the environmental aspects that can undermine a sense of safety, stability, or bonding. So this list includes substance use, mental health issues, parental separation, divorce, household members being imprisoned or jailed, natural disasters, living in a war zone, poverty, racism. All of these and more fall under this environmental umbrella of stressors. And each of these stressors, I mean, we've talked a lot about the LA fires on this podcast, a natural disaster of sorts, right? And a true stressor that I guarantee you we will see biological impacts, not just from all the things that were burned and then became aerated and people breathed into their bodies, but also the stress that they experienced as they fled their homes and as they lost everything, and that's one teeny example.
And when we talk about this list, one of the things in this list is divorce or parental separation. And about 50% of marriages in the United States, it's actually declining. The rate of divorce is declining in this country, end in divorce, which means that, not all of those people will have had children, but in those marriages, if they have children, they will experience what is considered an adverse childhood experience. And here's what's so complicated and fascinating, Cara, and we'll unpack a bunch of these, which is like a kid can have two loving, thoughtful, well-meaning parents and not experience all these other things. And yet it is still considered, they could be co-parenting beautifully and doing all the things that are there to support and love and nurture a child. And yet that experience is considered an adverse childhood experience.
And just to round out the definition, in this study, in the original study and going forward, a child, the C of ACEs, is defined as someone between birth and 17, so under 18. And all of these ACEs can be viewed through a slightly different lens, something called social determinants of health. So social determinants of health is a phrase that if you start listening for it, you'll hear it everywhere. These are the non-medical factors that influence a person's health and well-being. This is what ACEs are. ACEs essentially are social determinants of health. They are one type of social determinant of health. There are other social determinants of health that are beneficial, right? The ACEs are the challenges. They throw up the hurdles. So there are non-medical factors that put some people in an advantageous situation. You can feed yourself well. You know where you're going to bed every night. You can get health care. You have a great education, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That is a set of social determinants of health. And likewise, the flip side, all of these ACEs also can be called social determinants of health. And again, what is not on this list is all of the other stressors that clearly impact kids' bodies and brains in similar ways to the ACEs. Things like academic stressors, extracurricular stressors, achievement culture stressors, right? The things that might go along with the positive social determinants of health, the things we think set kids up for a healthier or safer or easier life, but still present very downward impacts on their bodies and their brains.
Right. And when we use phrases like poverty and racism, right? Or if we drill down on those things, housing insecurity due to poverty or food insecurity due to poverty, we think about, and we're going to get into the way this interacts with puberty. We think about people living in communities where they're closer to violence, where housing is harder to come by, where there are food deserts, where there are healthcare deserts, right? These are massive, massive categories that, as you said, Cara, they're not just childhood experiences, they're entire human being experiences as social determinants of health in that category. And when we start to sort of unpeel the onion of all of these things, it is just so many layers of our society. We're going to discuss how we can make this category feel more understandable, less overwhelming, and also explore the ways in which sometimes they're preventable, not always. Sometimes they're preventable, and also how to respond to ACEs, how to recognize and how to respond to them so that we know there are so many things adults can actually do to support kids in the wake of these experiences.
So, Vanessa, when we prepare for our podcasts, we read books, we read articles. I listen to a lot of podcasts. You listen to a lot of podcasts just to try to educate ourselves in every way. And this is a topic we've wanted to cover for a long time, but I actually was listening to the Mel Harris podcast series not too long ago. I was listening to an episode where she interviewed an endocrinologist about the immune system and all the autoimmune disease that's out there in the world. And the section of the podcast that caught my ear was one where she said, this doctor is going to read the 17 diagnostic questions so that you can determine whether or not you are at risk for an autoimmune disease. And Vanessa, do you know what the guest read?
The list of ACEs?
Correct. That was the list of questions. It was literally the list of screening questions for ACEs, which I thought was fascinating because it just speaks to how non-niche this topic is. This topic is not about children. It is about all of us. And it is not just about stress and the growing body. It is about stress and all of our bodies.
Yeah. I mean, Cara, I'd love to hear what you think about the 0 to 17 age frame, because you and I have raised kids past the age of 17, and we know that childhood in both physically and emotionally, doesn't stop at 17. And of course, parenting most definitely doesn't stop. So I'm curious to hear about that. And I would love us to explore that in the context of the physiological stress response and how those two realities, the sort of growing, developing brain and body of a kid and young person and the stress response, how those two things interact and can have ongoing impact.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to guess that someone's going to reframe this as the adverse childhood and young adult response or experiences looks, because we know that brain development runs all the way through the 20s or for the better part of the 20s. And so much of the physiologic response to the ACEs, which is specifically called the toxic stress response, and I want to explain that. But that toxic stress response doesn't change when you have your 18th birthday. And in fact, many would argue that as kids are leaving the home and they are moving either to college or to their own living situation where they're working, or to the military, or wherever they're going when they leave the house, and they are relying upon their own brains, and they don't have a particularly strong place in an employment market where they can't really get the jobs to pay for the healthiest foods, to be able to have the best apartments in the safest neighborhoods, and there are a lot of arguments for the stressors increasing, not decreasing, in those post high school years. I'm very interested in reading studies that look at the difference between the way we do it in this country, where we kind of launch kids, versus the way a lot of other countries do it, where their kids stay close to home. And I shouldn't really make it a geographical thing, because it's really more cultural than it is geographical. And there are lots of cultures in this melting pot of the United States of America where kids do stay at home. And when those homes are supportive and stable, those young adults will often thrive in certain ways. In other ways, they may or may not. That's a much bigger conversation. When there are stressors in those homes, right, they are continually exposed to those stressors. Let's talk for a second about the phrase toxic stress response, because Vanessa, you and I always talk about the adrenal glands and cortisol and adrenaline and the impacts on the body. You know, I'm wondering, are you new to this term? You're a doctor by default is what I call you, a DBD. But, do you want to walk through the distinction you make in your mind?
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because we spent a lot of time thinking about and talking about chronic stress, particularly as it relates to the onset of puberty, because there is really good research about how chronic stress can tip kids into puberty earlier, that the adrenal glands, which, as I say, depending on the audience, are the little yellow, I either say yellow triangles or yellow Hamantaschen, which are triangle-shaped cookies that we eat around the holiday of Purim. Some crowds get that joke, some crowds don't. So the adrenal glands are the triangles that sit on top of the kidneys, and they have cortexes, and the different cortexes release different kinds of hormones, and included in that is the hormone cortisol, which is the stress hormone. And what was interesting to me, so as kids are in elevated levels of chronic stress, they live in elevated levels of cortisol. And elevated levels of cortisol, as we'll talk about, has all sorts of knock-on effects, including the sort of evolutionary effect that I am under threat, right? It's from our early days as human beings that something is going to get me. I need to survive. And part of survival is, I need to reproduce before I'm no longer here. And so the body can decide to, with all that elevated cortisol and the hormones racing through the body, to put that body into puberty earlier in order to reproduce before they are extinct. Now, those are, caveman terminology, but that's actually what a lot of researchers talk about. But there's another impact of the cortisol, Cara, that I'm wondering if you want to talk about in terms of peripheral fat conversion.
Yeah. So what you're talking about is exactly right. It is that we accelerate the maturation of the reproductive system when we think the end of life is coming closer and the reproductive system isn't fully mature yet. That is an evolutionary response to that. And a lot of researchers believe that is one of the explanations for why puberty is beginning earlier. Now, I'm going to poke a hole in that and say, yes, but it's not happening faster. It's starting earlier, but it's not speeding up. And you would think, if the anthropologist's view of why we go into puberty earlier when we're under stress were actually correct, then, for instance, the average age of first period would be moving up proportionately to the average age of pubertal onset, and it's not. So that leaves us lots of episodes to debate that and to start understanding that. And I don't think anyone understands that. That's one downstream impact. The next is sort of system by system. How does toxic stress response, too much cortisol and adrenaline coursing through your body all the freaking time, how does that impact different systems in your body? There's data that it changes the way your immune system works. There's data that it changes the actual way your brain develops and the way you make decisions. And then there is data that shows that it impacts your hormones, specifically your sex hormones. And I'm not sure there is consensus yet on the how of how this works, but a couple of theories. Theory one is all those stress hormones actually go to work inside the brain, and they tell the hypothalamus, a gland inside your brain, to release GnRH, which is the precursor hormone that goes from the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland, another gland inside your brain, tells the pituitary gland, release LH and FSH. And LH and FSH are those two hormones that, regardless of your gender, travel down to either your ovaries or your testicles, whatever you have, and tell them to produce their hormones and start puberty. So one theory says the toxic stress response causes a surge in GnRH, which begins the domino effect of starting puberty. Another theory holds that those stress hormones, when they circulate in your body, work as catalysts to convert hormones from one form to another. And because hormones like estrogen and testosterone and DHEA and DHEAS are all cousins, they all share a very similar backbone, and they just have a little change here or there that changes their functionality. These circulating stress hormones can actually drive conversion towards estrogen, towards the hormone that drives female puberty. And if this is the case, and it is actually, there's a lot of science that shows this is how it goes, then a body that is not yet in puberty suddenly has more estrogen than it's ever had before. And the brain interprets that as, oh, we're doing this. Okay. And begins the cycle of the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland to the ovaries back up to the brain. And so instead of starting at the front end with the dominoes, you're kind of starting in the middle of the domino game and you're shifting the board there. And then it begins the cycle. And the debate really is it one more than the other? Is it both? Doesn't matter. But what we know for sure is that when you look at kids who have ACEs, there is what we call a dose response curve. The more ACEs they have, the more physiologic impacts they have of those ACEs. And one of the physiologic impacts is earlier puberty.
You talked about the Mel Robbins podcast and you talked about the questionnaire, and mental health professionals will literally count up how many ACEs a kid or a person has had. And if you listen to our episode with Jess Leahy on substance use disorder and addiction, she goes into, as you say, the dosage, the relationship between number of ACEs and likelihood for things like substance use disorder. Mental health professionals will talk about the likelihood of mental illness as a result of the number of ACEs. I mean, it's a very weird thing to think about because you're like literally counting. Like you could be counting on one hand what these massive life experiences are. And it's not destiny. And this is an important part of the conversation. But when we think about kids in earlier puberty, for example, that's one where there's not a ton so far that we know can actually be done as earlier puberty in response to sort of systemic chronic stress. But some of the other things we're going to talk about, there are, and maybe even more than we know of, ways to, if not prevent, at least respond to some of these experiences.
Such an interesting word you used, destiny. It's not destiny. And yet, one of the things that people talk about, specifically Nadine Burke Harris, who was the very first Surgeon General of the state of California. And if you're going to go read or watch or listen to anyone on this, I recommend you listen to her. She's amazing. But she talks about, and has talked about for decades, the tendency for this cycle of ACEs to repeat generationally. And it's because of systemic racism and the cycle of poverty and sort of the pieces that fall into place in this country, given how we have set up our social safety nets. And there's a lot happening in the world politically right now. But this is all to say that if we don't address some of these approaches to the systemic drivers of ACEs, we know for sure we're going to have ACEs pile up for our kids, and there are very real physical and mental impacts, which we're going to get into in a second.
So, Cara, as it relates to number of ACEs, there's sort of a bright line at 4 ACEs, 4 and more ACEs. Can you talk about like how that works and why there's that distinction?
The short answer is that just like there's a dose response for toxic stress, there's this cliff at 4 or more ACEs, where when someone hits that magical number of 4, answering yes to 4 of the ACEs screening questions, suddenly the impacts on their body and their brain go from, yeah, it could happen, the chance is higher, to almost inevitable. You know, the numbers are dramatic. So we're going to get into actually what that means inside the body and inside the brain. I want to share some of the data. This is just super top line. You can find this data anywhere. If you have 4 or more ACEs, you are twice as likely to have heart disease, cancer, or stroke. You are 4 times as likely to develop depression. You are 12 times as likely to risk attempting suicide. You ask the question, what is the bright line? It is not just bright, it is neon. This is a huge dividing point. If you can get the number of ACEs that a kid is exposed to below 4, ideally it's 0, but if you can get it below 4, you are changing the trajectory of their life.
And theoretically, that data is sort of backwards looking at this point, right? Like we look at people with these chronic health conditions and we look backwards and sort of and work our way to ACEs. But to your point, Cara, if we live with an awareness of the downstream impacts of ACEs and we can put in place either preventative or at least responsive behaviors to those ACEs, then God willing, those downstream effects, and those are stroke and heart disease, there's mental health, and there's also substance use disorder, and that's related to, the mental health concerns. I mean, those 2 things are so intertwined. The list of who is at risk for ACEs is very, very long. The list of communities who are at risk for ACEs are very, very long. And I feel like having listed them all, people have a good sense of, who is at risk. I'd love to spend some time talking about what can we do? What do we look out for?
Yes.
How do we respond? What are the things that if they aren't in place, we can put in place to help counteract? And listen, again, there are some things we have control over, and there are some things we don't have control over. The LA wildfires, there was nothing that could be done. Entire communities were affected by it in the blink of an eye, in a day or two or a week. There was no preventing that, but there is responding in the aftermath, for example.
Vanessa, I would love to read a little bit of a list that has been published by the CDC under, if you look up ACEs and you look up risk factors and you scroll to the bottom of the page.
I know, which kind of bummed me out when it took me so long to get to the bottom. I mean, listen, I'm just grateful this page is still on the CDC website.
Fair.
So I guess we should start there. But we'll link to this in the show notes because it's really important for people. There's some really, really good content, both as Cara mentioned in the CDC and also Cleveland Clinic. And we will link to them. But for this particular list, you have to scroll way, way down.
Scroll way down and look for the header that says protective factors, which is really the answer to the question you are asking, which is what can we do? So this is a partial, I'm not going to read the whole thing because it's beautifully long, which is very hopeful.
Yeah.
Right. But these are the types of things that protect us and the kids in our lives from ACEs. Okay. Families who create safe, stable, and nurturing relationships, meaning children have a consistent family life where they are safe, taken care of, and supported. Children who have positive friendships and peer networks. And I would take the S off of friendships and invoke Lisa DeMore here, who talks a lot about you only need one meaningful friendship. Children who do well in school, that can be defined a lot of different ways, by the way, but that is protective. Children who have caring adults outside the family who serve as mentors and role models. Vanessa, that one gives me chills because you and I, when we are not podcasting and we are not newsletter writing and we are not doing all the things, we are out there talking to people about our business and we fight hard to emphasize the trusted adult audience. And people are like, no, it's really about parents. And we're like, oh, it's the whole thing. The trusted adults are critical. The educators, the mentors, the coaches. Bullet number 4 under protective factor against an ACE is having someone outside of your family who loves you and cares about you. And it goes on, where families where caregivers can meet basic needs for food, shelter, and health services. By the way, those health services right now face risk because we're in a cost-cutting environment and a lot of the subsidized healthcare is on the chopping block. So if you want to help protect kids, one thing you can do is fight for their access to healthcare. There are many, many, many bullets. There is a whole section of community protective factors. So it's not just about what you do inside your home. If you don't have kids, if your kids are grown, if you care about kids who live elsewhere, there is a list of things that you can do to help give them access to economic and financial health, medical care, stable housing, child care. Having access to child care changes the game in terms of the well-being of children as they grow up. So this list to me is everything because there's lots to do.
And if you are parenting or caring for a kid in your life who has been through something and your spidey sense is telling you all is not well, the child is not sleeping, the child is bedwetting, the child is school avoidant, the child's eating habits have changed, right? If you have a sense that all is not well, find a mental health provider, a school counselor, a chaplain, a pediatrician, find someone who is trained to assess and help you find resources, because while the list is overwhelming and the worry is overwhelming, there is much to be done in response. This is not the end of the story here, but it can have a big impact, and we want to make sure that we address it with the kids in our lives.
Vanessa, I know this was teed up to be a hard conversation, but it's ending in a very hopeful place. And I think the more we all talk about ACEs, the more we can do to erase them from kids' lives and to quiet that bright line so that fewer and fewer kids are hitting that threshold number of 4 or more. It starts with us. It starts with us taking care of ourselves and putting our oxygen masks on. It starts with us being in community with other parents and trusted adults. You are listening to this podcast. If you got all the way to this part of the podcast, you are all in. You are there and you are already fighting the good fight. But I'm really hopeful that one day this episode is irrelevant. I know a lot of what we talk about is evergreen. I hope this isn't.
God willing.
Thanks, Vanessa.
Thanks, Cara. Thank you so much for listening. You can email us with questions, feedback, or episode requests at podcast@lessawkward.com.
If you want to learn more about what we do to make this whole stage of life less awkward for everyone involved, our parent membership, our school health ed curriculum, our keynote talks, and more are all at lessawkward.com.
And if you want products that make puberty so much more comfortable, visit myumla.com.